The lake was alive that night. Black water thrashing under a bruised sky, the rain cutting like glass. He wasn't supposed to be there, not that late, not that far from shore. But fate has its own way of whispering. When he heard the scream, faint and broken, it sliced through the storm like a dying breath. He saw her, a small figure swallowed by waves, hands vanishing beneath the dark. Without thinking, he plunged in. The cold bit into his bones. The world narrowing to that desperate pulse beneath the surface. When he reached her, her eyes were wide open, terrified, almost peaceful. And in that moment, he swore he'd never forget them. He pulled her to the rocks, pressed life back into her lungs, and when she breathed again, the storm seemed to still, as if the lake itself had exhaled. He never even asked her name. He just left her there, trembling under the rain, alive. Morning broke with a soft haze over the lake, as if nothing had ever happened. But some silences linger long after the storm fades. Ethan stood on the dock, the echo of her gasps still trapped in his chest. He tried to convince himself she was safe, that it was over. Yet the water stared back at him like an unblinking eye, reminding him that debts between the living and the lake are never truly settled. He dropped the drenched hoodie into a bag, but his hands shook when he noticed a small ribbon, white, torn, clinging to his wrist. He didn't remember it being there. He tied it around his wrist without knowing why, a strange token of a night he wished to forget, but somehow couldn't. Years slipped by like fading tides. The lake became a distant whisper, replaced by life, a new city, a career, a love that felt safe. On a quiet evening, as Ethan and Clara sealed their wedding invitations, the past brushed his shoulder. The mailman handed him a small envelope with no return address, its paper cold and damp as if kissed by rain. Inside was a single card, ivory embossed and faintly smelling of lake water. No words, just a pressed white ribbon tied into a bow. His breath caught. He told himself it was a prank, a coincidence, but somewhere deep inside he knew. The lake remembers, and so did she. A week before the wedding, Ethan drove back to the old town. He told Clara it was for errands, but truth lay deeper. Beneath the waves, the lake looked smaller now, quieter, as if pretending to sleep. He walked along the rocks where it all began, the same wind brushing his face, the same scent of rain and pine. But when he looked down, he saw footprints, small, bare, fresh, leading from the shore to the water's edge. The air grew colder. He turned, half expecting no one, but there she was, standing in the distance, hair streaming, eyes unblinking. Not a ghost, not a dream, just her, Lila. They stood in silence, the air thick with things unsaid. She smiled, faint, almost trembling, and said she'd been waiting for him to keep his promise. He wanted to protest, to say there was none, but her words struck deeper than memory. That night came rushing back. The rain, her hand clutching his, her whisper before he left. "If I live, I'll find you again." He thought she was delirious. Now, standing before him, she was that promise reborn. When he reached for her, she stepped back toward the water. "Soon," she said, her voice like wind on the surface. "When you wear white too." And then she was gone, swallowed by the fog, leaving him alone with the echo of his own forgotten vow. The morning sun broke through lace curtains soft and golden, as if blessing the day before it began. Ethan stood before the mirror, adjusting his tie, smiling at a reflection that didn't quite believe itself. Around him, laughter drifted through the walls. Friends, music, the faint scent of roses. Clara's voice carried from the other room, light and full of life. He told himself this was everything he ever wanted. Yet behind the calm, something restless stirred, the sound of waves crashing where there should be silence. He thought of the lake again, of her face rising through rain. The ribbon still clung to his wrist, hidden under his sleeve. He should have thrown it away. But something inside whispered, "Not yet." Clara stood before the mirror in her gown, a vision of serenity wrapped in lace and promise. The dress shimmered like morning mist, each detail hand-sewn, each pearl a piece of devotion. Her friends surrounded her, laughter bubbling, tears of joy catching in mascara. Yet for a moment her gaze drifted, not at the dress, but at her reflection, where a flicker of unease passed behind her smile. She couldn't name it. A cold breeze brushed her shoulder, though the windows were shut. She looked down and saw a petal, damp, pale, resting on her veil. She didn't remember any flowers that color. Still, she whispered Ethan's name, and the unease faded. Love, she told herself, doesn't leave room for ghosts. Guests filled the old chapel, their whispers rising like birds under vaulted ceilings. The scent of lilies and polished wood mingled with soft organ music. Ethan stood at the altar beside Reverend Holt, his palms damp despite the cool air. Clara's father gave him a reassuring nod from the aisle, but Ethan's mind was elsewhere, fixed on the faint reflection of rain in the stained glass. Outside, clouds were forming again, gray and heavy. Jonas leaned toward him, murmuring, "You good man." Ethan smiled and nodded, but the truth sat in his throat like a stone. As the doors closed and the organ swelled, he felt the same sensation he'd felt years ago by the lake, that something unseen had just entered the water. The music swelled, and all heads turned as the great wooden doors opened. For a heartbeat, everything froze. No sound, no breath. Standing at the entrance was a woman in white. But it wasn't Clara. The light from outside framed her figure, her gown flowing like mist, her hair glistening with rain. Lila stepped forward, silent, eyes fixed on Ethan. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, confusion rising. Reverend Holt faltered mid-sentence, his voice breaking. Ethan couldn't move. He'd seen ghosts in dreams, but never like this. Not breathing, not alive, not real. Yet she was there, alive, beautiful, uninvited. And she was wearing white. The world seemed to tilt. Clara appeared behind the bridesmaids, her smile fading as she saw the stranger. Lila's gaze never left Ethan. Her voice, when it came, was soft, almost kind. "You promised." The words cut through the air, sharp as thunder. A low rumble echoed outside as rain began to fall, tapping against the stained glass. Clara stepped forward, confused, her hand reaching for Ethan's arm, but he didn't move. The ribbon beneath his sleeve burned against his skin, tightening, as if remembering. Then, as the first bolt of lightning cracked the sky, the church lights flickered. For a moment, everyone was bathed in the ghostly blue of stormlight, and in that breathless flicker, Ethan saw the lake again. Only this time, it wasn't Lila drowning. It was him. The church was a breath away from chaos. Rain hammered the roof like a warning. The organ faltered, and every face turned toward the girl who wasn't supposed to exist. Ethan's voice cracked as he tried to speak her name, but it came out like a prayer he wasn't ready to finish. Lila stepped closer, water dripping from her gown onto the aisle, each footstep echoing louder than thunder. "You said you'd come back," she whispered. No one understood. Clara's eyes darted between them, her bouquet trembling. Reverend Holt called for calm, but his voice was swallowed by the storm. Ethan felt trapped between two worlds, the one he built with love and the one he abandoned in the water. When Lila reached the front pew, the candles flickered, their flames bending toward her like breath, drawn in fear. No one knew what to do. Jonas moved first, stepping in front of Ethan, voice raised, "Miss, you need to leave." But Lila's gaze passed through him like mist. She turned to Ethan again, her voice barely audible. "You pulled me out that night," she said. You said if I lived, you'd find me again." The words rippled through the room, disbelief washing over every face. Ethan's mouth opened, but nothing came. Clara looked at him, not angry yet, just frightened, like watching a crack form in glass. "Who is she?" she whispered. Ethan's silence was answer enough. Lila lifted her hand, revealing the ribbon, the same one tied beneath his cuff. "You kept your promise," she said softly. "Now I've come to keep mine." Later, when the guests were ushered into the rain-soaked courtyard, the three of them remained: Ethan, Clara, and Lila. The silence was unbearable. Clara's voice broke it first, fragile and sharp. "You saved her," Ethan nodded slowly. "Years ago, she almost drowned." Clara turned toward Lila, tears brimming. "And now you're here. Why?" Lila smiled faintly, her wet hair clinging to her face. "Because he promised he'd find me. He never did." Ethan took a step forward. You disappeared, Lila. I thought you." She cut him off, eyes darkening. "I died that night, Ethan. Part of me did. The rest waited." Her voice cracked like glass under strain. "And now you're marrying someone else." By evening, the storm had passed, but its echo lingered. The ceremony was postponed. The guests left in confusion. Ethan sat alone in the chapel pews, staring at the wedding ring still clutched in his palm. The gold felt heavy. Wrong. He tried to slide it onto his finger, but it wouldn't fit, as if his body refused to forget. The ribbon pulsed faintly beneath his sleeve, leaving a pale mark on his skin. From the doorway came a whisper. "You can't wear two vows." Lila stood there, bathed in fading light. He rose to face her, voice cracking. "What do you want from me?" Her reply came slow, trembling, yet sure. "I want what you promised. To be saved." That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. The storm had left the town drenched and breathless, but inside him, something still raged. He walked the empty streets until he reached the lake, calm now, deceptive in its peace. The moon shimmered across its surface, reflecting 1,000 tiny lights that seemed to move like eyes. He heard her voice again, soft as the tide. "You never really left." She was there, standing by the rocks, barefoot and dry, the same as the night he'd found her. "Why did you come back?" he asked. She smiled, faint and haunting. "Because I never left the water. You pulled me out, but you didn't take me with you." The lake rippled at her words, and Ethan felt it. The same pull. The same promise dragging him home. The fog rose thick and heavy, curling over the water like smoke from a dying fire. Ethan stood at the same place he had years ago, the rocks slick with memory. The lake looked different now, calmer, almost patient. Behind him, footsteps approached. Lila emerged from the mist, her gown whispering against the stones. She seemed untouched by the chill, her skin luminous under the pale moonlight. "Do you remember what you said?" she asked softly. He nodded, his breath shallow. "I said I wouldn't let you go," she smiled, but her eyes shimmered with sorrow. "Then why did you?" Her words struck harder than the wind. Ethan's voice trembled. "Because I thought you wanted to live." Her gaze dropped to the water. "I did. But you left me with the part that couldn't." The surface of the lake rippled, though no wind stirred. Lila's reflection trembled, splitting into fragments of silver. "They never found me, you know," she whispered. "Not the me that drowned." Ethan shook his head. "You're alive." She stepped closer, the hem of her gown touching the water. "Am I?" Her voice was soft, but something beneath it echoed. Deeper, older, as if spoken by the lake itself. Ethan felt the pull in his chest, that magnetic ache drawing him nearer. The ripples began to hum, the air growing colder. "You can still save me," she said, eyes glistening. "But you have to come back where it started." For a heartbeat. He swore he heard a second heartbeat beneath the waves, one that matched his own. By dawn, the fog began to thin, painting the horizon in muted gold. Ethan sat on the rocks beside her, exhausted, shivering. He told her everything. The dreams, the guilt, the years spent trying to forget. She listened in silence, her face unreadable. "I came back because I thought saving you meant something," he said. "It did," she murmured. "You gave me life, but not peace." She looked toward the horizon, voice trembling. "I was meant to die that night, Ethan. You changed what wasn't supposed to be changed." His throat tightened. "Then what do you want me to do?" She turned to him, tears catching in the first light of morning. "Let me go, for real this time." Her hand brushed his, warm and cold all at once. "But when you do, don't look back." Back in town, Clara awoke to an empty bed and an ache she couldn't name. The storm had left branches scattered outside, the air damp and heavy. When she saw the car missing, she knew. She followed the road that wound through the forest until the lake came into view. There on the shore, she saw two figures, one standing, one kneeling, framed by the fading mist. Her heart twisted. She didn't call out, only watched. The woman in white leaned close, whispering something Clara couldn't hear. Ethan's shoulders trembled. The lake behind them shimmered faintly, like breath exhaled from the earth. Clara's tears blurred the scene until all she saw were two silhouettes, one fading into dawn, the other left behind. The sun had barely risen when she stepped into the water. Ethan followed her to the edge, calling her name, his voice breaking. "Don't," he pleaded. Lila turned back, smiling gently. "You already saved me once. Now save yourself." The water lapped at her knees, her waist, her shoulders, until only her face remained above the surface. For one last moment, she looked at him. "Goodbye, Ethan." The ripples spread wide as she vanished beneath the calm. He waited for her to rise again, but she didn't. The lake was still. The air was silent. Then, slowly, the ribbon slipped from his wrist and drifted into the water, sinking after her. And for the first time in years, the lake looked peaceful, like it had finally let something go. The lake was silent again, too silent, as if it had swallowed the world. Ethan stood there long after the ripples faded, his knees sinking into the wet earth. The morning sun climbed higher, turning the mist to gold, but he felt none of its warmth. The ribbon was gone. Lila was gone. All that remained was the echo of her voice. Soft, forgiving, fine. He waited for her to surface, to laugh, to breathe again, but the water stayed still, reflecting nothing but the hollow shape of a man who'd finally kept his promise. Behind him, footsteps crunched on gravel. Clara approached quietly, her shadow merging with his. She didn't speak, didn't ask. She just placed her hand on his shoulder, and in that touch she felt both mercy and mourning. Days later, while unpacking the remnants of what should have been their wedding, Clara found a small envelope tucked inside her veil. The handwriting was delicate, almost childlike. For him. She hesitated, then opened it. Inside was a pressed ribbon, white, frayed, and a note written in fading ink. "Thank you for giving me back the breath I lost. I never wanted to haunt you, only to be remembered as someone who was saved." Clara's eyes blurred as she read the final line. "Tell him the lake is calm now." She folded the letter, holding it to her chest, realizing that love sometimes lingers not to possess, but to release. Ethan avoided mirrors for weeks, afraid of what he might see. But one night, as rain tapped against the window, he caught his reflection in the glass, and for a heartbeat, it wasn't his face staring back. Lila stood there instead, smiling softly, her hair floating like it had in the lake. No fear, no anger, just peace. He blinked, and she was gone, leaving only his own weary image behind. He leaned closer to the glass, whispering, "Rest now." The lights flickered, and for a moment he swore he heard her reply, "You too." That night he slept without dreams for the first time since the drowning. Months later, Ethan returned to the lake, not out of guilt, but gratitude. The seasons had changed, wildflowers lined the shore, and the water sparkled with sunlight. He sat where he once pulled her from the depths, his hand brushing the cool surface. "You were right," he murmured. "Some promises aren't meant to last. They're meant to free us." A gentle breeze rippled across the water, carrying a faint whisper that could have been his imagination, or her goodbye. He smiled for the first time in months. The ribbon he'd once worn now rested beneath the waves, its fibers dissolving into the lake's quiet heart. In time, people stopped asking what happened that day. The town remembered it as a wedding interrupted by a storm, nothing more. Ethan and Clara moved on quietly, their love tempered by loss, but deepened by truth. On their anniversary, they returned to the chapel, now empty and sunlit. Ethan placed a single white lily at the altar, where once there had been chaos. "For her," he said simply. Clara took his hand. The stained glass cast ribbons of color across their joined fingers, blue and gold, dancing like ripples of memory. Outside, rain began to fall, gentle, steady, alive. Somewhere beyond sound, the lake sighed, and a ghost smiled, knowing she'd finally been let go. Years passed like slow-moving water, reshaping everything in quiet ways. The lake was no longer a wound, but a memory, one that shimmered when the wind was still. Ethan walked its banks every autumn, tracing the same path that once led to his salvation and his haunting. The trees leaned older, the stones smoothed by time, yet the sound of the water remained the same, a heartbeat beneath the surface. He often wondered if it remembered him, if memory could cling to ripples the way it clung to the heart. One afternoon, he tossed a single pebble into the calm, watching the circles widen. "For what was," he whispered, "and what couldn't be." The circles merged, faded, but never disappeared completely. Neither had she. That night, Clara dreamt of the lake. She walked barefoot along the same rocks where Ethan once stood, her gown trailing behind her, glowing faintly under a pale sky. The water was calm, alive, whispering her name. When she looked down, she saw not her reflection, but Lila's. The girl smiled softly, her hair drifting in the water as though she floated just beneath the surface. "Thank you," the reflection whispered, "for loving him enough to let him stay." Clara reached out, her fingers brushing the cool surface, and woke to find tears on her cheeks and the sound of distant rain against the window. It wasn't a haunting. It was a farewell. Years later, a boy ran laughing through the trees. Their son, 6 years old, chasing dragonflies near the same shore. Ethan called after him, smiling as he carried a picnic basket, the air rich with summer. The boy knelt by the water, peering into the depths, then turned with innocent wonder. "Dad, there's a lady down there." Ethan froze mid-step. "What lady?" he asked gently. "She smiled at me," the boy said, pointing. She waved. Ethan approached, heart trembling. The lake was clear and still, reflecting only clouds and sky. He placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Maybe the lake remembers us," he whispered. The boy nodded, content. And as they walked away, a faint ripple followed behind them, slow, tender, endless. When the years grew heavy and the house quiet, Ethan began to write, not to anyone living, but to the one he could never forget. His letters spoke of peace, of love, of the way times softened even the deepest storms. He never mailed them. Instead, each summer, he'd fold one neatly and set it afloat on the lake, watching until it sank beneath the calm. "You once asked me to save you," one letter read. "But I think it was you who saved me. You taught me that love doesn't always end with keeping. Sometimes it ends with letting go. The water carried his words without answer, but in the soft breeze that followed, he felt her there, still listening. On his final visit, Ethan stood by the water alone. The years had folded him into quiet stillness. His eyes carried both weight and peace. The lake was perfectly still, mirroring the sky in flawless blue. He whispered her name, not in grief, but gratitude. "We made it," he said softly. A breeze rippled across the water, and in that trembling reflection, he saw her once more, Lila, smiling, radiant, unchanged. She raised her hand as if to wave, her image dissolving into light. Ethan closed his eyes, and for the first time, the sound of the lake felt like laughter. When Clara found him hours later, he was sitting peacefully, eyes open toward the horizon, the lake calm and endless. And the ribbon, white, frayed, and faintly glowing, floated beside him. The day they laid him to rest, the sky was soft and merciful. The town gathered quietly by the lake, where his story had both begun and ended. Clara stood by the water's edge, her black veil lifting gently in the wind. She didn't cry, not because she didn't mourn, but because she understood. Ethan's ashes were scattered into the ripples, each grain a memory returning home. As the lake swallowed the last trace of him, the water shimmered faintly, as if acknowledging its child come full circle. For a moment, the air was still heavy with peace. Then a breeze stirred. Cool, familiar, carrying the faint scent of rain and lilies. Clara whispered, "He's home now." And somewhere beneath the calm, the water whispered back. That night, when the mourners were gone and the moon rose over still water, Clara lingered alone. The surface reflected her in silver light until another reflection appeared beside hers. A young woman in white barefoot, her hair swaying in the night breeze. Lila. She looked unchanged, timeless, her eyes soft and bright. Clara didn't startle. She simply turned her head, tears welling. "You waited for him," she said quietly. Lila smiled. "We both did." They stood together for a long moment, two women bound by love, loss, and the man who had saved them both. One from the water, one from loneliness. Then Lila stepped backward into the lake, her image dissolving into moonlit ripples that glowed like a blessing. Weeks later, Claire found a stack of envelopes tucked in Ethan's drawer. Letters addressed to no one, sealed but unsent. She opened one, and the words bled through in his neat handwriting. "If you're reading this, it means the water has finally forgiven me. I never wanted to forget, only to stop drowning in what I remembered." Each page was another confession, not of guilt, but of gratitude. He spoke of Lila's forgiveness, of Clara's love, of the quiet beauty in being human enough to make promises and break them. Clara smiled through tears. She folded the letters, tied them with a white ribbon she found inside, and placed them by the window, where the lake's reflection shone through the glass. One summer evening, Clara returned with her son. The boy, now grown, stood beside her in silence as the water lapped gently against the shore. He loved this place, he said. It's where he found her, and where he found himself, Clara nodded, placing a small jar of wildflowers on the rocks. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a faint shimmer appeared in the center of the lake, soft, white, pulsing like a heartbeat beneath the water. "Do you see that?" he whispered. She smiled. "It's just the lake remembering." They watched until it faded, the reflection of light melting into dusk. Love, she thought, never truly dies. It simply changes form, like water. Years later, the lake became a legend. Locals spoke of strange reflections, lovers seen holding hands just beneath the surface. Two shapes, always side by side. Some said it was a trick of light. Others swore it was real. But on quiet evenings, when the air was still and the sky burned pink, The reflection was unmistakable. Ethan and Lila, together, standing where the water met the sky. She no longer looked lost. He no longer looked haunted. They simply stood, eternal and peaceful, bound by the promise that love, once made, once broken, once forgiven, never truly ends. And on the wind, faint but real, came laughter, light as ripples and lasting as time.